All right, as we've just seen, in literature and visual art in the Romantic period, there is a lot of drama. We had these pictures that would just tell us these intense stories about people and the things that were happening to them. We see the same thing happen in the music from this time period. It is intense. Most of the music that you hear when you go to concerts comes from this period of time. The pieces that people know really, really well tend to come from this time period. Whether that's because we're still sort of close to the Romantic period in terms of time frame, that we play a lot of that, or if it's just that it's music that resonates with us, I'm not sure. But you'll hear a lot of it. Even if you go to the movies, even if it's new music, even if it's been composed for the movie, it might sound a lot like music from the Romantic period because it generates so much emotion. This is the whole purpose in the Romantic period, to generate emotions. We've seen that in the past. In the Baroque, we had emotional things. We had that whole thing about the doctrine of the affections and how it's supposed to affect our body and our emotions. But remember, in the Baroque, you're only allowed to have one emotion at a time. You get to the Romantic period, and a single piece, even a short piece, might take you through a wide range of emotional feelings. So if you find a piece of music and you're listening to it and you don't know where it came from, and it changes dramatically throughout the piece, you'll know that it's at least from the Romantic period, if not from the 20th century. So how do we get that whole dramatic feeling? How do we create those emotions in our music? One of the ways that we do that is by just changing things. As we saw in the Classical period and the Baroque period, if a piece started in a particular kind of mood, it tended to stay in that mood. So you didn't have a piece that was happy, jolly at the beginning that ended up being morose. It just doesn't happen very much. When you get to the Romantic period, that's more like the norm than the unusual thing. So a piece will go through a lot of different emotions by changing tempo. So we might have sections that are fast, we might have sections that are slow, we might have sections that are in the middle, and they could even change very quickly, just as your emotions do. Sometimes you're in a very tense situation, and then, maybe there's this little lull where things are okay and it's not so stressful and everything sort of relaxes, but then you're back in the flurry of it. So changing the tempo is one way that we can do that. So you hear multiple tempo changes in many Romantic pieces. Another thing is to change the dynamic level. And when we're talking about dynamics in the Romantic period, we are talking about big changes of dynamics. Remember, in the Baroque period, you would hardly see anything beyond piano or forte as a dynamic level. You get in the Romantic period, they might put 4 Fs to tell you to play it as loudly as you could possibly play it under control, or 4 Ps, so be very, very quiet. One of the reasons they mark these things so clearly is that in this period of time, the composer is not always going to be there when the piece is performed. Up to this point, the composer was probably part of the performance. They would have been playing the piano or the harpsichord or something in the orchestra and would have been there to tell the musicians, okay, I want you to play this way. When we get to the Romantic period, the composers are less likely to be involved in the performance itself because now composers can make a living as composers. They could sell their sheet music. They could write pieces for specific orchestras or individuals. So they were making a living from the composing itself. So they didn't necessarily have to be there when the piece was performed. So they had to put everything in the music that they wanted it to be so that the performers would know how to do it. We start seeing metronome markings. So that, the little thing that goes tick, 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 although these days it goes beep, beep, beep because they're mostly electronic. And you can set it and say, okay, I want this beat to be what happens. The beat is this. So I have my metronome, I turn it, I set it there, and I know exactly how fast the composer wanted that piece to be. Doesn't mean I'm going to perform at that speed. I could make my own decisions, but that's what the composer had in mind. They would also write lots of things in the music to tell us about how they wanted it to be done. We know they could put in staccatos and legatos and tempo changes and dynamic changes and slurs and all those things that tell you basically how to perform it, but they really wanted to make sure you got the emotional content of this. So they would put in new terms like giocoso, which is a lovely Italian word for joyfully. Now, how do I tell how do I tell you to play joyfully? I mean, I can't tell you to push down certain buttons or do certain things. But you, as a performer, would go, okay, they want it joyfully, then I might play this section a little bit more lightly, not play the notes as strongly. I would make some interpretation of what Giocoso was supposed to be. They might put con amor, lovingly. Again, it's not something you can just say, this is how you do lovingly, but it gives the performer an understanding of what the composer was trying to get you to do. So they would use all these terminologies that would tell the performers, this is my general idea about how I want this piece to happen. So if you look at a piece of sheet music from the classical period and you put one from the Romantic period right next to it, the classical one's going to look very tidy because there's hardly any markings on it. But the modern Romantic one's going to be just stuff everywhere, lots of crescendos, lots of decrescendos, accents in weird places, lots of those markings that tell us how to perform it. So the composers really wanted to make sure that you knew what their purpose was in finishing up that piece. So all those things help to give us that changeableness. Because we've got much more specific instructions in music, we can do more changing. And that's how we get that range of emotion. So the melody itself in the Romantic period, the ideal melody, even if it was for an instrument, would be that it would be something that you could sing if you wanted to. So I might have written this piece for, French horn solo. But I want it to be a melody that a singer might also take and use. And they were very successful at that. In fact, so much so that if you get like into the early period of movies when they started putting sound in, they would go back and take some of those earlier pieces from the Romantic period and just add words to them and make theme songs for these movies. It happens all the time. So the idea that the melody should be singable, even if it's an instrumental melody, is very much a Romantic kind of idea. Obviously, vocal melodies are supposed to be singable, because if you can't sing it, how can singers do anything with it? So instruments in this period of time, we now have a few new ones. The tuba is a new invention in the Romantic period. So now we can add that to the orchestra, to our brass family, and have a big, fat bottom sound. And for composers who are really trying to get bigger and bolder sounds, that's important. There's some like gigantic tubas that are even bigger than the ones that we use today that were used in this period of time, because it was a way for the composer to really create that volume of sound that they wanted. We have some massive orchestra pieces from this period. They require hundreds of musicians. We need all that big sound. We also have very intimate little pieces like solo piano works, vocal works that you and your friend might sit down and do if you were both good musicians, obviously. But even that kind of range we have, from really big works to very tiny, intimate little works. So we not only within a piece do we have this big range of things happening, we have it within the whole range of types of pieces that we have from the period. The saxophone is a new instrument during this period of time. Unfortunately, it doesn't get adopted very much. There are very few pieces of art music from the period that use the saxophone. So when orchestras play those pieces, they have to go out and hire a saxophone player because they don't keep one on the books because there's so little for them to do. But the saxophone does come from this period of time. This is also the period of time where we start adding valves to our brass instruments. So you'll start to see that the brass instruments have much more melodic kinds of lines to play rather than being sort of accenty chord structures, which we would see in the classical period earlier. So those are the three big contributions to the instruments. Some of the instruments that have been around a little while that are not new but get used more would include the piccolo, because it's really high pitched, and if you're trying to get a very dramatic effect, like screaming people or something like that, piccolo is a great choice for that because it's really high and very piercing. You want to do witches screaming. The piccolo is a great instrument for that. So that use of those instruments is also something that's fairly new in the Romantic period, and we call that using instruments in very purposeful kinds of ways orchestration. Remember when we talked about the Baroque period, we said that a composer wouldn't necessarily even say which instrument this part should be played by. They would just write the music, and if you could play it, you could play it. And the Romantic period composers are very specific about that. They were trying to generate a very particular tonal palette. These are the timbres that I want to hear. These are the kinds of sounds that I want to hear. So they really studied what an instrument could do. You know, what does this instrument sound like? You know, what's its best quality? How can I showcase that? So composers really focused on that. In fact, Rimsky-Korsakov wrote a book about how to do this. It's sort of the standard still of how to best utilize the equipment in your orchestra. Very important. So as you listen to Romantic music, you won't see a lot. I mean, you can't see the music itself. You don't know what's written in it. But you might imagine, what did the composer put here? What terminology might I apply to this to get to this kind of sound that I got? Does this sound like the composer was saying, I want this to be played furiously? Or does this sound like the composer might have said, I want this to be played in a childlike way? So you can think about that kind of aspect of it, because the music is going to be much more something that you're familiar with. It's going to generate the kinds of feelings that you're used to getting from music. So you can think about, what was the composer really trying to tell the performer from that? What might this music look like on the page that I can't see, but I can hear? So think about that. Think about the melody and how beautifully singable it usually is, and think about all the emotional content that we get out of a piece of Romantic literature.